So let's start out this segment with a question. Do you personally know anyone who attended the New York World's Fair in 1964 or 1965? I've read books on the subject, articles, watched films, but none are quite as invaluable as actually talking to someone who attended the event. My grandmother, like most grandparents, would often reminisce about things that happened before I was born. Holiday celebrations, how she met my grandfather, and every once in a while, she'd share a little bit about their trip to New York City in 1965. She'd talk about taking her kids on an airplane, walking through the city, and seeing Shea Stadium. The 1960s mark an interesting and exciting period in American history. Certainly a time of transition in our country. As one great man put it,
some would say that those struggles are all over, that all the horizons have been explored, that all the battles have been won, that there is no longer an American frontier. But I trust that no one in this assemblage would agree with that sentiment. For the problems are not all solved, and the battles are not all won. And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected to the office of the 35th President of the United States in 1960, beating out the former Vice President and avid monorail advocate Richard Nixon. Kennedy was so well-spoken and young. Well, I mean, he was young for a president, but he really represented a new vision for our country.
But I believe that the times require imagination and courage and perseverance. I'm asking each of you to be pioneers towards that new frontier. My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to the stout in spirit, regardless of party, to all who respond to the scriptural call, be strong and of good courage, be not afraid, neither be dismayed.
In his speech, he'd also referenced the uncharted areas of science and space, an idea that really resonated with Americans interested in beating the Russians to the moon. Walt Disney once said that
the space race that began with Sputnik not only influenced education, but American pop culture as a whole.
The Disneyland television show had already demonstrated what a trip to the moon might look like. It wouldn't be long before Americans were inspired to change their television sets from shows like The Lone Ranger to Lost in Space and Star Trek. Heck, the icon of the Century 21 Expo in Seattle was known as the Space Needle.
Everybody's planning to see Seattle's spectacular $100 million World's Fair.
So pack up your troubles and forget your cares. Pack up your family and head for the best in Seattle.
Many Americans were far less interested in space travel, however, and much more interested in solving some of the social issues that still seem so prevalent in our country during the 1960s. As Kennedy put it,
100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
In 1963, Kennedy unveiled what some people at the time saw as a radical piece of civil rights legislation, extending the right to vote and eliminating legal discrimination in public accommodations like hotels and restaurants. Admittedly, these hardly seem like radical ideas by today's standards, but for many Americans at the time, changes like these just weren't happening fast enough. For example, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had a decent enough rapport with Kennedy, but felt actions like these didn't go far enough. King continued to organize protests in order to help dismantle segregation and combat racial inequality. There were several other civil rights leaders who felt the same way as King, including the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, James Farmer. The goal of CORE was to bring together regular people in order to peacefully protest segregation. In the early 1960s, Farmer had started to organize freedom rides, which challenged segregation practices that were still common while riding interstate buses in the South. Mind you, this kind of segregation had already been deemed unconstitutional, but several southern states must have missed the memo.
What is the mystery of Bus 509? Why are these three people on it?
Civil rights sure have come a long way in this country, but are we moving fast enough? What else can I do to help end racial inequality?
Hey, this isn't so bad. Those freedom rides are way more relaxing than our last Freedom March.
These two look like they're enjoying themselves. But wait till we hit that Macy-Dixon line. That's where the real protest happens.
It's such a comfort to take the bus and leave the driving to us in a Greyhound bus. Lucky us in a Greyhound bus.
At first glance, the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, New York, seemed somewhat inspired by the words of John F. Kennedy. A major feature of the fair was a 2-acre section located adjacent to the Hall of Science called Space Park. Some of the objects on display included a Project Mercury spacecraft that had orbited the Earth and a model of the Apollo craft that would one day carry Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong to the moon. The theme of the New York World's Fair was peace through understanding, an idea that on the surface seemed like it really addressed some of those things that we talked about earlier: ignorance, prejudice, things that our country was still dealing with. Still, civil rights leaders weren't convinced, likely due to the actions of this man.
Mr. Barnaby!
Nope, not him. Still not right. That's him. Robert Moses was one of the most notorious power brokers of the 20th century. At one point, he held a dozen different titles throughout the state of New York, most of which pertaining to the metropolitan area. He was appointed as Long Island's Park Commissioner back in 1924 and then New York's Secretary of State 3 years later. During that time, he'd oversee projects that would greatly improve New York's infrastructure and help create a plethora of new jobs. In the 1930s, Moses snatched up 3 miles of undeveloped land located in Queens known as Flushing Meadows. This would be the venue used for the 1939 World's Fair. Did you know that Walt Disney did participate in the 1939 fair in some small way? There was a special Donald Duck Day celebrated on August 14th, 1939. It was not uncommon for these kinds of fairs to hold special days to help boost attendance. There would be a Superman Day in 1940 and a Lucille Ball Day at the 1964 World's Fair. In addition, Disney collaborated with Nabisco to create a special animated short that would be shown at the fair.
Oh, Mickey, Nabisco, Lorna Doone, social teas and Oreos.
Yeah, my mother used to buy them all the time. And here's my favorite.
Oh, Mickey, Big Newton.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
The 1939 World's Fair remains one of the most beautiful international expos, ever, and helped to cement Robert Moses as a master builder. Unfortunately, Moses had several shady or just flat-out immoral practices that the leaders at the time elected to ignore. Many of these improvements would decimate communities and displace people of color. He'd tear down low-income homes to help anchor his bridges. Roads and highways would be constructed through black neighborhoods. One project in the South Bronx would even displace somewhere around 1,500 families. By the 1960s, Robert Moses had been appointed, not elected, to several prominent positions, including President of the Long Island State Park Commission, Chairman of the New York Council of Parks, New York's Secretary of State, President of the Bethpage State Park Authority, Chairman of the Emergency Public Works Commission, President of the Jones Beach Park Authority, Commissioner of the New York Department of Parks, Chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, Commissioner of the New York City Planning Commission, Chairman of the New York State Power Authority, and in the 1960s he added the President of the 1964 New York World's Fair, which would also take place in Flushing Meadows. I think it's also worth recognizing that by this point in time, Robert Moses had become really one of the main targets of protest by civil rights activists. They were completely fed up with his policies of so-called urban renewal. In addition, the workforce that Moses would bring in to build his fair would be overwhelmingly white, leaving African Americans and Latino workers feeling left out and rightfully angry.
At the groundbreaking ceremony, our late President John F. Kennedy met Robert Moses, president of the fair.
I want the people of the world to visit this fair and all the various exhibits of our American industrial companies and the foreign companies who are most welcome, and to come to the American exhibit, the exhibit of the United States, and see what we've accomplished through a system of freedom.
As Flushing Meadows began its transformation once more, the lives of New York's marginalized remained largely unchanged. People were just tired of unemployment, rundown schools, and crumbling tenements. It's completely reasonable to consider how the money being spent on the World's Fair may have been better utilized to help the people of New York City. The Brooklyn chapter of CORE had developed an interesting act of civil disobedience to take place during the opening of the World's Fair. 500 drivers would make their way down one of Moses's newly renovated highways and break down, run out of gas, or just simply stop. They called it a stall-in. The plan was extremely controversial, and even CORE President James Farmer was firmly against the idea. The stall-in proved to be largely unsuccessful, but it wasn't the only protest plan for the fair. The New York World's Fair took place roughly 5 months after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He was succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. President Johnson was scheduled to speak to the World's Fair attendees on opening day, April 22nd, 1964.
This fair represents the most promising of our hopes. It gathers together from 80 countries the achievements of industry, the health of nations, the creations of man. And so I take my leave of what Ogden Nash has called the promised land of Mr. Moses.
Several activists were present as well. During Johnson's speech, they would hold up signs and shout out,
"Jim Crow must go!
Freedom now!"
Over 700 people were present to protest on opening day. Many activists were arrested, including James Farmer. It's quite possible that the actions of these individuals helped to motivate President Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act just a few months later in July of 1964, which in turn prohibited the practice of segregation in school and public accommodations and discrimination in elections and employment.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
James Farmer left the Congress of Racial Equality in 1966, but continued his advocacy for civil rights. As I'm sure most of you know, America became the first nation to land on the moon in 1969, a truly amazing, defining moment for American history, if a little bit bittersweet for some of our marginalized population.
I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon.
Several Americans still wondered if the resources that we were putting into the NASA space program couldn't be better utilized to help the disenfranchised in our own backyard. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Robert Moses's reputation continued to fade, as did his ability to manipulate the political landscape. It became increasingly difficult for Moses to implement his ideas of urban renewal. He died on July 29, 1981, at the age of 92. You know, the 1964 World's Fair was really an incredible event that brought people from around the world to Flushing Meadows in order to celebrate mankind's achievement and look forward to what the future had in store for our planet. Of course, many people still felt excluded from that vision, which probably helped to inspire several more protests throughout the life of the fair. Still, the event did leave a lasting impact on the 20th century. For a brief moment, Flushing Meadows became the cultural mecca for Googie architecture and design. Attendees had an opportunity to experience some incredible artwork from around the globe. Even today, you can still appreciate some of Walt Disney's timeless contributions to the 64 World's Fair, including great moments with Mr. Lincoln, the Carousel of Progress, and a little boat ride meant to remind us all, regardless of where we were born or the color of our skin, that we all share the same planet. Recently, one of the architects of It's a Small World passed away. If you are a fan of Disney Imagineering, you may be familiar with Rolly Crump. He started his career at Disney in 1952, working on films like Peter Pan and 101 Dalmatians. 7 years later, he joined the Imagineers, where he worked extensively on The Enchanted Tiki Room. Rolly Crump was one of the key individuals in the creation of the Small World attraction at the New York World's Fair. His handiwork is evident in many of the toys and figures you'd see throughout the ride.
There is just one moon and one golden sun, and a smile means friendship to everyone. Though the mountains divide and the oceans are wide, it's a small world after all.
The Sherman Brothers are responsible for many of our favorite Disney tracks, but they really outdid themselves when writing the title track for It's a Small World. It's a quintessential part of the ride. Another quintessential part of the ride was the style, or the visual aesthetic. Artist Mary Blair was largely responsible for the endearing look of the attraction. After contributing to films like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan, she'd be enlisted by Disney in order to bring her signature style to the happiest cruise that ever sailed. You know, another important woman in the creation of It's a Small World was the super talented Alice Davis. She was brought in to help bring Blair's vision to life. Specifically, Miss Davis would create over 150 different costumes for all of the animatronic figures appearing in It's a Small World. Oh, and here's one more name that people often forget about when talking about It's a Small World. Actress Joan Crawford. At a time when it was uncertain whether Disney could or should help Pepsi Cola to build an attraction for the New York World's Fair in 1964, some historians credit Miss Crawford for motivating the board members at Pepsi to endorse this project. Stay tuned, because I'll include some commentary from those historians in just a bit. So let's take a moment and celebrate a force of nature in Hollywood, the woman we all know as Joan Crawford, and explore how It's a Small World may not have existed without her influence. But first,
have you noticed? You hear something new at the fountains today.
The lively crowd today agrees. Those who think young say Pepsi, please. They picked the right one, a modern light one. Now it's Pepsi for those who think young.
If you've worked up a mighty thirst, take a break and enjoy a clean, refreshing Pepsi Cola. Pepsi Spark will bring back your energy and taste better cold than any other soft drink in the world. Put it to the taste, the test. Pepsi, for those who think young.
Taste that beats the others cold. Pepsi pours it on.
A certain Miss Lucille Ball was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1908. Well, at least according to her own account. While Crawford's gravestone lists 1908 as her date of birth, several resources actually suggest the real date might be a bit earlier in 1906. Regardless, Joan, or rather Lucille, started her acting career during the silent era of film. She signed a contract with MGM Studios, and from what I've read, she earned around $75 a week. Her first credited role was in the film Lady of the Night, serving as a body double for Norma Shearer, which is pretty impressive since during the silent era, Shearer was the bee's knees. A feminist pioneer and early sex symbol of the silver screen who Hollywood couldn't seem to get enough of. Turns out cameras loved Lucille as well, and so did audiences. Soon after, Joan Crawford started getting larger roles, even starring in a few films later in the 20s. Crawford was driven to become a Hollywood starlight. Some would say obsessed. Someone in the industry once said,
"No one decided to make Joan Crawford a star. Joan Crawford became a star because Joan Crawford decided to become a star."
When Hollywood started transitioning into talkies and sound became increasingly more popular, it proved difficult for many actors and actresses to make that transition. Determined to be a star, Crawford wound up being one of the few actresses able to make that change. Of course, it didn't hurt that she was also a talented dancer. Crawford must have taken a few lessons from ladies like Norma Shearer, since audiences started to notice the modern sexuality she'd bring to her roles.
This happens to be my room, Mrs. Haynes. It's yours, yes, for the time being, like everything else you've got. May I suggest if you're dressing to please Stephen? Not that one. He doesn't like such obvious effects. Thanks for the tip. But when anything I wear doesn't please Stephen, I take it off.
You know, those two leading ladies even co-starred in the 1939 film The Women. Great title, by the way. It's touted as a sensational hit featuring 135 women with nothing on their mind but men.
All right, girls, come on. Come on, you feet, everybody. Now, come on. Jesse, take care of these girls, will you? All right, come on, girls. The beer number. Please.
Hello, Duchess.
Hello, Mr. G. How many nip-ups today? Feel pretty light on my feet.
Crawford would appear opposite leading man Clark Gable in several films. People seemed to enjoy their chemistry on the screen, and that same chemistry seemed to continue off-screen as well, since an alleged affair between Crawford and Gable seemed to have been responsible for her separation and eventual divorce from her first husband, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. She'd marry 3 more times during her life. Crawford's marriage to actor Franchot Tone would last from 1935 till 1939. Her marriage to her third husband, Philip Terry, lasted from 1942 till 1946. Now, up to this point, each of Joan Crawford's husbands were themselves actors in their own rights, and the erratic nature of movie shooting schedules certainly didn't help these unions. Crawford may have recognized the dilemma because in 1955, she was married to her fourth and final husband, businessman Alfred Steele. Steele was incredibly successful in the soft drink industry, having worked as vice president of marketing at the Coca-Cola Company for several years before leaving to go to their biggest competitor, Pepsi. By the way, Crawford was no stranger to cola when they met. She already appeared in several Royal Crown advertisements in the 1940s. You know, she must have really loved Steele for her to switch brands. People are pretty loyal to their cola of choice. In fact, Pepsi products can often be seen in several of Crawford's films. According to the New York Times archive, Crawford married Alfred N. Steele, the company's board chairman and chief executive officer. Mr. Steele logged more than 100,000 miles a year in revitalizing the soft drink company's worldwide activities. She started traveling with him, flying to gala openings of new bottling plants and conventions, and serving as hostess of parties on their trips, as well as their spacious East Side Manhattan penthouse. You know, 1955 was a pretty important year, and not just because Joan and Alfred's nuptials, it's also the year Disneyland opened. Pepsi Cola was one of the official sponsors for one of Disneyland's original attractions, the Golden Horseshoe Revue. Pepsi Cola would continue to sponsor the Golden Horseshoe for over 25 years, and during that time, they were able to build a decent relationship with the Walt Disney Company. In 1959, Alfred Steele suffered a heart attack and passed away. That didn't stop Joan from staying on at Pepsi Cola, and she continued to build a reputation in New York as quite a philanthropist. According to the New York Times, Miss Crawford became a leading benefactor, fundraiser, and an honorary official for dozens of charitable organizations, explaining to an interviewer in 1971,
"I've been on the receiving end of so much good that I feel I have to give something back."
In the early 1960s, several notable companies were prepping for something big in Flushing Meadows, New York. Robert Moses, the president of the New York World's Fair, promised an event unlike any other.
"We have roamed these United States and literally combed the globe for pavilions and exhibits which will reflect the achievements of all men in industry, culture, the arts, and harmless entertainment. We confidently expect more than 70 million visitors to an unforgettable pageant."
The Coca-Cola Company was well on its way with its plans for the fair and expected several thousand visitors to its pavilion. One of the pavilion's highlights would include the Global Holiday, a 15-minute walk that would take fairgoers around the world. This free attraction was planned so that people can see and touch everything and was extremely well received. Time magazine put it on their best of the fair list, and Forbes praised the experience, stating that the walkthrough had an almost magical transition through sights, sounds, and smells. Pepsi Cola would have to respond with something big in order to stand a chance against their biggest competitor. Unfortunately, Pepsi was dragging their feet, and with less than a year left, they had to decide on something. Now, this story is somewhat controversial and has been scrutinized, so my goal here is to outline what evidence we've encountered and leave it to the viewer to decide whether or not it sounds credible. I first discovered this story back in 2019 while visiting Disney Imagineering in Glendale, California. My wife Marcy Renee and myself were invited to explore their campus with a good friend of ours. Our tour guide on this trip was Michael Iwerk, one of the Imagineers over at Disney, and if his name sounds at all familiar, it's probably because his family has built quite a legacy at the company. The name Iwerk, it's been an institution at Disney for a number of decades, like Leslie Iwerk. She's an extremely talented Oscar-nominated director responsible for both the Pixar story as well as the Imagineering story on Disney+. By the way, there's a really great segment in there about It's a Small World if you have that streaming service. Leslie's father, Don, he was a Disney executive who had his hand on attractions like America the Beautiful and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And of course, there's Ub Iwerk, Walt's closest collaborator at the beginning, and the man really responsible for refining the look of the original Mickey Mouse, essentially bringing the character to life. You know, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the names Iwerk and Disney, they go together like peas and carrots, and we definitely couldn't have asked for a better tour guide while visiting Disney Imagineering. Now, with all the top secret projects they were working on, we couldn't take many videos, but I did get permission to take a handful of pictures. We'd visit the original WED building after their move in 1961, and even got to stand in the room where Walt housed that giant Florida project map you see in all those pictures. Behind the original complex sits Disney's Grand Central Creative Campus, formerly the Grand Central Airport. Now, back in the day, this facility hosted aviation legends like Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and Howard Hughes. Hughes even used this complex in his epic film, Hell's Angels. Today, you'll find this really awesome museum alongside several spaces being used for Disney Imagineering. My favorite? was the library used for resource material. Some of the books back there were so old, and I really wish I could have spent the entire day digging through those shelves. They had a lot of modern books as well. One that caught my eye was Yesterday's Tomorrow, Disney's Magical Midcentury. If you're not familiar with this book, it's written by the legendary Don Hahn. Don has authored a number of amazing books about Disney, but is probably most well known for producing Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. Yesterday's Tomorrow contains a number of rarely seen photos and illustrations highlighting Walt Disney's impact on the mid-20th century. It should come as no surprise that there are chapters dedicated to all 4 of Disney's attractions at the New York World's Fair. Now, this is the first time I read about Joan's involvement in the Small World attraction. In the book, it says that Pepsi board members dragged their feet on the decision, and at the last minute, board member Joan Crawford reached out to Walt for help, with just a year left until the opening of the fair. WED was filled to capacity with work for the other 3 pavilions it had committed to, and didn't need the pressure of another. Upon further research, I discovered that author and World Fair historian Bill Cotter offered a similar account. According to Cotter, Imagineers had originally rejected Pepsi's proposal, but when Joan Crawford bumped into Walt at a party afterward, well, it wasn't hard to get Disney obsessed with a new idea. Walt then went to his Imagineers, who were already stretched thin working on the Magic Skyway, the Carousel of Progress, and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. He told them about an idea that he had, about a boat ride featuring the children of the world. Can you imagine how the Imagineers responded? I think they thought he lost his marbles, but it wasn't easy to change Walt's mind. And by the time the meeting was done, the Imagineers had their new assignment. Within a month, plans for a 32,000 square foot structure were sent to Pepsi-Cola headquarters in New York.
Pepsi-Cola presents Walt Disney's It's a Small World, a tribute to UNICEF.
When Disney showed the preliminary plans for the show to the board of directors at Pepsi, the reaction was poor. There's this great interview with Disney legend Joe Fowler where he explains how the meeting went down. Fowler said that when he met with Pepsi's board of directors, it was composed of Joan Crawford and 4 or 5 old gentlemen who had completed their usefulness years previously. According to Yesterday's Tomorrow, once again Joan Crawford stepped in and forced the point, pushing the board to approve of Walt's plan, which they did out of fear that they would have nothing at the fair. Joe Fowler described it a bit differently. He said Joan Crawford stepped in and gave those boys a beautiful dressing down. If you're not familiar with that term, it means the Pepsi board received a severe reprimand.
Get out! Get your things out of here before I throw them into the street and you with them. Get out before I kill you!
What's that for?
I do that in all my pictures.
According to Joe, 10 minutes after Crawford dropped the hammer, the group finalized plans for It's a Small World. In addition, the Pepsi Company would partner with the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. When the fair opened on April 22nd, 1964, It's a Small World was an immediate success. The ride cost 95 cents for adults and 60 cents for children, with the funds going to UNICEF. The marquee outside the Pepsi-Cola Pavilion was known as the Tower of the Four Winds. This dynamic sculpture was also designed by the late great Rolly Crump.
Hope we have some good winds back there in New York. This little mobile is a scale model of our Tower of the Four Winds that stands at the entrance to the UNICEF Pavilion at the World's Fair. And the real tower is, how tall is the real tower, Rolly?
It's 120 feet.
120 feet. And it can be seen from all over the fairgrounds, we hope. So when you visit the fair, ask your friends to meet you under the Tower of the Four Winds at our pavilion here.
Disney's press release described the structure.
Attached to 3 primary columns and 4 slender buttresses will be more than 100 spinning, swiveling, oscillating elements of as many colors and shapes. Propellers of every description and size, a miniature, purely decorative carousel with animals from several countries, a stylized representation of the sun, Figures of birds, flying fish, winged dragons, butterflies, bees, and other creatures, all will be in perpetual motion.
Now, the tower's colorful figures represent animals from all over the world, I think, don't they?
That's right.
What animals?
Oh, there's a camel and a llama and...
Where's the camel?
The camel's the little green ball on the carousel.
That's the camel?
The tower was an absolute landmark at the New York World's Fair, but wasn't the only artwork you'd want to experience. Don't believe me? Well, for example, the Spain Pavilion shared masterpieces by Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco.
The pavilion cost the Spanish government more than $7 million and took 9 months to build. The ceiling consists of blocks of Flemish pine carved in Spain and then painstakingly fitted together here.
Attendees could experience modern works by Dali, Miro, and 3 pieces by the legendary Pablo Picasso.
In the art gallery, there are 3 flamboyant Picassos. This one depicts the artist Gauguin. Spanish officials bought them in France, where Picasso, a native of Spain, has lived for many years.
Over at the Vatican Pavilion, guests could experience Michelangelo's Pietà.
Pizza time! Yeah, give me a slice of anchovies and peanut butter.
Not pizza. I said Pietà. It's an incredible sculpture depicting the body of Christ in the arms of his mother just after he was taken down from the cross. If I'm not mistaken, it's the only work to have ever been signed by the master sculptor. It's been suggested that an average of something like 78,000 people visited the Vatican Pavilion each day, making it the second most popular attraction at the fair. Right across from the Vatican Pavilion was another extremely popular destination.
There's the New York State Pavilion. We're getting closer. It's only so close you can get without actually climbing all the way up there, which of course we're not allowed to do, but that would be cool.
Inside, you might find artwork from the famous Hudson River School of Painting, or portraits of early New York colonists. However, the outside of the pavilion showcased the handiwork of those delinquents of the art world, the curators of commercialism known as pop artists. A crude clan of retrobates led by Robert Rauschenberg, James Rosenquist, Robert Indiana, Roy Lichtenstein, and their most notorious member.
My name is Andy Warhol, and I just finished eating a hamburger.
Or at least Warhol would have been featured at the fair had he not created a piece that was considered so controversial it was immediately taken down before the fair opened in 1964. So, what could have been so offensive that it had to be hidden from fairgoers? You know, I'm going to go ahead and guess it wasn't 13 varieties of Campbell's soup.
Made with milk and country cream and 7 garden vegetables, bursting with flavor and tasty goodness. For a quick but hearty soup and sandwich lunch, serve Campbell's Cream of Vegetable Soup. Try Campbell's Great Cream of Vegetable Soup, an old-fashioned tomato rice soup.
When your car needs gasoline, it knows how to ask for it. But when your car needs service, it can't ask until it's sometimes too late. That's why this man has made a pledge to give your car big friend service. He's the biggest friend your car's ever had.
You can trust your car to the man who wears the star, the big bright Texaco star.
The New York World's Fair in 1964 was an incredible opportunity for members of the petroleum industry to show off their brand. In fact, the Mobil Oil Company created a free experience for guests interested in testing their driving skills on a simulated cross-country adventure. But that wasn't nearly as exciting as what Sinclair Oil offered fairgoers over in Dinoland. Prehistoric giants roamed the earth once more in Flushing Meadows. Not for nothing, but as cool as those fiberglass dinosaur replicas were, I'm still all about those Mold-O-Rama dinosaur figures. If this were smell-o-vision, we'd all be enjoying that sweet, sweet aroma of injected, molded plastic.
I'm gonna walk on over here just to see these beautiful
beautiful Mold-O-Matics. Love these things. I'm checking out today. We have a authentic Disneyland one. This is a real deal. This one is an actual real deal Disneyland one. And this is over here is a replica of the Sinclair Auto dinosaur machine, which was so popular during the 1964-65 World's Fair. So two very, very cool machines that I'm super stoked to be able to just kind of hang out by. Okay, let's not get too distracted because it's time to leave the transportation area and head over to the states and federal area because the Texaco Oil Company has done something truly spectacular over at the New York Pavilion just below the Tent of Tomorrow.
The building proper is covered by a translucent oval roof. It consists of innumerable sections of brightly colored plastic through which daylight floods the arena. What Philip Johnson has done is to take the European concept of the high-roofed arcade, like the one in Milan, and restate it in modern American terms. The effect is refreshing. It's pleasant to contemplate such a structure in the middle of New York or Chicago.
Now, once you're done staring at those beautiful translucent colored fiberglass panels, take a moment to fully appreciate the absolutely gigantic terrazzo map of the state of New York. Texaco was responsible for this mid-century masterpiece illustrating every road, community, river, and lake. In a way, it was kind of the world's largest triptych, for those of you who remember those. It took almost a full year to design, construct, and install this massive mezzanine, which, I mean, to put it into perspective, it's still less time than it takes me to fold a normal size map. Another impressive part of this pavilion were the 3 observation towers, which, contrary to what Hollywood will tell you, are still standing today. You see behind me the towers, and then moving over to the side here, check this out. So a lot of this pavilion would have been sponsored by Texaco, and Marcy noticed all the way on the other side, there's a Texaco logo. You can just barely see it. Wish I could get closer. But that whole mezzanine floor, the map that would have been on the floor, that was sponsored by Texaco. You can actually see, I think some of the flooring's still actually in there. But man, you got grass, you got weeds, you got plants growing out of it. Wouldn't have been there originally. But just the fact that this was built so well that so much of it's still here. You can see the canopy's gone. That stuff did not stick around. But it's pretty amazing what's still here. The observation towers offered an incredible view of the fairgrounds. They were 60, 150, and 226 feet respectively. In fact, the tallest tower was actually the highest point at the New York World's Fair. All 3 observation decks were accessible by elevators called sky streaks. Those were clear plastic capsules soaring up and down the outside of the tower. On your way up, you might notice the New York Pavilion's circular panoramic theater showing a 14-minute film called Around New York. The Walt Disney Company had already developed this style of 360-degree film for America the Beautiful, which premiered at the Brussels World Fair in 1958 and was then reproduced over at Disneyland in 1960. It wasn't the newest technology by 1964, but it still was very impressive, and the theater welcomed 100 guests at a time, standing room only. Around New York was shot in Theaterama, which, from what I understand, is more impressive than Disney's Circle-Rama, and undoubtedly had an entirely different experience than General Motors' Futurama, and absolutely had nothing to do with Sinclair's Mold-O-Rama. And again, I'm sorry, there's no smell-o-vision. We are working on that. So just around this building right here, this circular building, not only because you have seen Circle Vision on the inside, but just around this building right here, you would have seen some amazing artwork.
by some of the most popular contemporary artists.
Outside the theater proper, attendees could experience work from the bad boys of the art industry. For some, pop art was seen as almost derogatory and had no place in a museum and certainly should not be showcased prominently in public view. I find that so odd because men like Roy Lichtenstein helped jumpstart the movement in the 1960s with amusing pieces like Look Mickey.
You did it!
Lichtenstein became infamous for hijacking techniques closely associated with comics, like word bubbles or Ben-Day dots. His contribution to the New York State Pavilion featured a laughing redhead done in his signature style. Pop artist James Rosenquist created a mural that included overlapping sections from billboard advertisements. It was a commentary on a few affluent aspects of mid-century America, like patriotism, consumerism, and innovation. Now, one of my favorite pop artworks at the Pavilion was Eat by Robert Indiana. The giant sign featured 400 blinking lights, and, as legend has it, when it was lit, hordes of hungry guests would be attracted to the New York Pavilion like moths to a flame. I guess it's fortunate that the Pavilion would have offered a 700-seat restaurant operated by Schrafft's, which, from what I'm told, would have been a pretty well-known franchise at the time. Plus, they were experimenting with something new for the fair. Automatic vending machines featuring inexpensive food items like spaghetti, club sandwiches, and even their world-famous selection of ice cream. So famous that the legendary Andy Warhol would collaborate with the restaurant in the 1960s to help promote their new underground sundae. Warhol filmed a minute-long commercial to help promote the newest dessert. The people at Schrafft's were quite happy with the results. The same cannot be said about the mural Warhol created for the New York State Pavilion. Okay, so Andy Warhol. Most of you probably know him as the pop artist with the fascination for celebrities like Marilyn Monroe and the intense infatuation for America's #1 institution for canned soup, Campbell's. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Warhol loved soup. He once said in an interview that he'd have soup for lunch almost every single day. It's also been said that his sumptuous sentiment for soup started as a child when his mother warmed him up a bowl. The nostalgia may have blossomed into a deep admiration for the brand. But I digress. I bet you're wondering, how did Andy Warhol, the gentleman who elevated the stature of a soup can, how did he get kicked out of the New York World's Fair? Well, I'll tell you. By April 15th, 1964, all of the murals around the panoramic theater at the New York Pavilion had been installed. You got your laughing redhead over here, you got your Rauschenberg Skyway, you got your blinking sign that says Eat, and then, okay, are you ready for this? You have the 13 Most Wanted Men by Andy Warhol. Yes, 13 mugshots of New York's most wanted criminals hanging at the Pavilion meant to celebrate the Empire State. It wouldn't take long for news to spread. Officials decided it might be best not to include the mural as it might upset families with young children and possibly the local Italian community, since 7 of the 13 men were also of Italian descent. In fact, the New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller, took it one step further. He had the mural completely covered in silver paint. But the story doesn't end there. Warhol offered an idea for a replacement, a mural featuring multiple images of New York World's Fair president, urban planner, power broker, and an all-around polarizing figure, Robert Moses. Now, I'm confident that you all are intelligent people, so it probably won't surprise you to hear that they rejected Warhol's idea for his replacement work and felt it might not be appropriate to replace 13 views of New York's most wanted men with 13 views of Robert Moses. I don't know, though. I think it's kind of funny. Now, even though fairgoers may have been disappointed to miss out on experiencing one of Andy Warhol's artworks, I think that a Sinclair Moldorama figure is a fine consolation prize. But what if you don't like dinosaurs? Well, then you're in luck, because Walt Disney and his friends brought out several Disneyland toy factories for attendees to enjoy. One of the exciting parts of the Disneyland Toy Factory was that some of these machines would come adorned with Sleeping Beauty's castle sitting right up on top. We recently uncovered one of these mid-century marvels at our friend Tim's workshop and thought it might be fun to build a couple of replicas using the same techniques they'd used back in the 1960s. While doing a little research for this project, we discovered that Disney Imagineer Rolly Crump likely had a hand in designing these wonderful pieces. Mr. Crump certainly had an incredible impact on the '64 World's Fair, but before we run out of time, I'd like to discuss one last individual and fair attendee.
Hello, friends. Are you tired, run down, listless? Do you poop out at parties? Are you unpopular? The answer to all your problems is in this little bottle. Yes, with Vitamin you can spoon your way to health. All you do is take a great big tablespoonful after every meal.
It's so tasty, too.
Now let's travel to Flushing Meadows, New York in the year 1964. The New York World's Fair brought out everyone from Walt Disney to President Lyndon B. Johnson to the Queen of Comedy, the Technicolor Tessie, the First Lady of Television, Lucille Ball.
Quick side note, Lucy was in fact a native of the Empire State as she was born right here in Jamestown, New York.
She was no stranger to Flushing Meadows, having already attended the New York World's Fair in 1939. So it's both incredible and appropriate that 25 years later she'd be invited to the '64 fair as guest of honor. Monday, August 31st, 1964 was declared Lucy Day at the New York World's Fair. Lucy and her then current husband, Gary Morton, traveled to New York City courtesy of American Airlines. American was one of many airlines vying for the attention of fairgoers. It's quite possible they even rode on one of American's brand new 727 Astrojets. The event started at 10 a.m., where Lucy and the gang entered the fairgrounds through gate number 2. They rode in the fair's official white Cadillac convertible, visiting several destinations throughout the grounds. They were accompanied by a marching band from, of all places, St. Lucie High School in Newark, New Jersey. Every single member of the band was seen sporting a bright red wig, probably more similar to Ronald McDonald than Lucille Ball. Now, this should come as no surprise. The first stop on Lucy's trip around the World's Fair was the Hollywood USA Pavilion. And if you're not familiar, the exterior of this specific pavilion, it was a replica of Grauman's Chinese Theater, not unlike the runaway railway attraction that you'd find at Disney's Hollywood Studios in Florida. Lucy added her handprints in wet cement alongside well-known gossip columnist Hedda Hopper. Oh, and here's a fun fact. At the time, Lucy did not actually have her handprints at the real Grauman's in Hollywood, so this was a completely new experience. In fact, the only time that I can ever remember seeing Lucy at the Chinese Theater was that one episode of I Love Lucy where her and Ethel, they use a crowbar to steal John Wayne's footprints. I wonder if Lucy's handprints are still on site at Flushing Meadows. I just might need to bring a crowbar next time I visit the fairgrounds. By 11:15, Lucille Ball had arrived at the international area in order to visit pavilions like the Republic of China, Africa, Morocco, and she had an honorary luncheon at the Indonesian pavilion at 12:30. After lunch, Lucy performed a complete wardrobe change before heading over to Leisure-Rama. Now, Leisure-Rama was an exhibit featuring 2 inexpensive, fully furnished model homes made possible by the people at Macy's and Allstate Properties. These prefabricated houses were touted as the greatest advance in housing since the invention of the brick. About 200 of these lovely mid-century homes were installed in Montauk, Long Island. Hundreds more were built in the city of Lauderdale near Fort Lauderdale in Florida. Now, if you're looking for a home today or you've been delving into this housing market at all, you just might want to fast forward through this next part, because back in 1964, these Leisure-Rama homes, for just under $20,000, you too could own a beautiful home full of all the modern conveniences. Just imagine living in the house that's featured at the last scene of the Carousel of Progress. In fact, the refrigerator, the dishwasher, the washer and dryer combo were all provided by those fine folks at General Electric.
Right, Mother?
Yes, dear.
Okay, but no more distractions. We don't have time for Leisure-Rama or Mold-A-Rama or Future-Rama or any of these other Ramas, because we got to get back to our tour of the fairgrounds with Lucille Ball. Because just before 3 p.m., her procession would pass by the Johnson's Wax Golden Rondelle on their way to the iconic New York State Pavilion. There, Lucy took the opportunity to ride one of the speedy Sky Streak capsules to the top of one of the observation towers.
It's been a wild day, and it isn't over yet.
Are you as tired as everybody who's following you is?
Well, I don't know. It's been a little more exciting for me, probably, than people who are running alongside. But it's wild. It's really wild. We've had a ball today.
Really been enjoying the day, though, seriously?
Oh, I've had a marvelous time. Every place we've gone, we've been right on schedule, and all the people have been there, and everybody's been happy, and it's been marvelous.
At 5:30 p.m., Lucy found herself near Meadow Lake at the Hawaiian Pavilion to experience a taste of the Aloha State before heading back over to the international area and visiting the Spanish Pavilion. There, she was invited to participate in a very special presentation which included several flamenco dancers. She'd also do a little window shopping, enjoying some one-of-a-kind jewelry by artist Salvador Dali. Lucy Day wouldn't officially end until around 10 p.m., and while she'd probably be pretty exhausted by the events of the day, I really hope she was able to experience both the wonder and majesty that was the World's Fair at night. I also hope you all enjoyed experiencing the 1964 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, New York. Now, I'd like to hear from our viewers. Are you a fan of any of the individuals we discussed today? And is there anyone you'd like us to discuss in the future? Let us know in the comment section below. Oh, and if you enjoyed this documentary and would like to show your support, be sure to click that like button and subscribe to Retro Spectrum so you won't miss a single video showcasing the New York World's Fair.